the wonderful thing about meditation is that things become very apparent to you that were obscured behind all this thought pollution before. And so when we practice meditation, we start to enjoy a certain level of clarity, which wasn't there previously. So without question, yes, stress led to meditation. Meditation led to inner growth and inner experiences. In London, I worked in corporate public relations, so that was my job. I worked for a PR agency and we had offices right on Trafalgar Square, and most of our clients were like major banks, insurance companies, fund managers and the like. So it was a very specific form of corporate PR, and I really enjoyed it because I've always enjoyed the stories that numbers can tell and telling those stories in language. However, as stimulating as it was, I found it very stressful. And in fact, so stressful that I started to get rashes would appear on my body. And I went to see a doctor and he said, this could be caused by any number of things, but I'll prescribe you some antihistamine tablets and that'll fix them. And he did, and they worked wonders. But after about 2 months of walking around with a little bottle of pills in my pocket, I thought, this is not a sustainable situation where all you're doing is actually curing the symptoms rather than addressing the cause. So I went to see a naturopath who recommended that I start meditation to help deal with stress. And that was the start of my journey. So if you like, while living in London for a period was a very stressful experience, in another way, it was the start of everything. The best understood, the most widely recognized symbol of Buddhism is a lotus. And lotuses are the most exquisitely beautiful flowers, but they grow in swamps. And it's only because they grow in such muddy, difficult, dirty conditions that propels them to rise to the surface and to produce these beautiful, exquisite flowers. And that's a metaphor, if you like, for out of no mud, no lotus. Out of difficult, challenging situations, we can find something useful. And in fact, you could argue that it's only in challenging and difficult situations that we have the opportunity to thrive and to grow and to transcend. When I meditate, it motivates, it stimulates the creative process. In fact, very specifically with the Dalai Lama's cat, I'd had the idea of writing a book by the Dalai Lama's cat for quite some time. And I tried to do something and I wrote a few pages and I showed it to my wife and she said, the problem is the cat's just too catty. And so I put it in the bottom drawer and forgot about it for a while. But then one day I was meditating, and I can still vividly remember one Saturday morning, sitting on my cushion, not trying to think about anything to do with writing, trying to focus on the object of concentration. But this thought suddenly arose in my mind, write the Dalai Lama's cat as though it was my own cat, Wasik, speaking to me. I had a very close relationship with my little cat, and it was easy for me to imagine how she might sound on paper. And so that was very directly the genesis of the Dalai Lama's cat, because once I had that narrative voice in my mind, that unlocked the whole narrative process. So definitely when it comes to creativity, when we meditate, we are far more capable. We're in a much better space for creative ideas to arise. And I think it's really quite easy to understand this. If you think about the opposite state of being when you meditate, it's one of anger and stress. And think, when was the last time you were really angry and pissed off with things that you had a brilliant idea? It never happens. We have our best and creative ideas when we are in a state of playfulness, of childlike joy, and feeling relaxed. Creativity is an accident, but we can all learn to become more accident-prone. And we become more accident-prone, if you like, more creatively prone by putting ourselves into a state where we are more likely to experience these wonderful things that just naturally arise from our minds. Mind training is very, very similar to training the body. And just as in the West, we totally accept that if you sit on the sofa all day and eat junk food, it's not going to be good for you physically. We have difficulty understanding that exactly the same thing applies to our minds. If we do the mental equivalent of sitting on the couch and eating junk to our minds, then we're also going to be mentally unhealthy, which goes back to the whole question of social media and how we need to be careful and how we deal with it. But it goes well beyond that, because just as the ancient Greeks started the Olympic Games back in, I think it was 500 BC, well before that, the ancient Indians had been, if you like, worshipping at the feet of the master meditators rather than the master athletes. So in the West, we're obsessed with physicality. In the East, they're far more interested in what we're capable of doing mentally. We have this idea that we have about ourselves as little bags of bones, wandering through life, blown by this force and that force, is actually quite a pathetic view of ourselves. We are capable of far more than that. Our minds are capable of the most extraordinary states of calm, serenity, and bliss. When I was young, in my teenage years, I met a fascinating lady who became my godmother, and she told me the story about how she went to Tibet in the early 1950s when it was still a free country. She explained that she had this burning question in her heart that she wanted to ask a highly realized being, and she hoped to meet a Lama who could give her the answer to her question. And after a very long flight from London, they arrived in Lhasa, and she was taken to a monastery. And she and a very small group of people were taken around the monastery on a tour. And at the end, there was a question and answer session with a Lama, and who had an interpreter, and a few other monks were standing in the courtyard, very elderly monks. She didn't want to ask her question in front of all the other people there. There were only a few, but she didn't want to reveal her personal life in front of them. So she felt disappointed that she was going to miss on this opportunity to ask this very deeply important question to her. As the group was being shown out of the gates of the monastery, a very old monk beckoned the interpreter, the translator, and Kay, my godmother, and through the translator, he said, "Tell the lady the answer to her question is this." And he then started to speak. And when Kay told me that, the hairs on my spine, just back of my neck, just went up, and I thought, this is extraordinary. That was the first time I'd heard about clairvoyance as something that's a natural byproduct of having a highly realized mind. And it always stayed with me. And so later in life, when I started meditating to deal with stress, it had no connection with that in my mind initially. But the more I explored meditation, the more I began to understand stress management is like really at the foothills of the mountain when it comes to the benefits of meditation. It's very basic, it's useful, it's important, but it's really nothing compared to what our minds are capable of. When we understand that our minds are, far more transcendent, far more boundless, far more blissful than most of us can ever possibly imagine. And we have these powers that are available to us, or that are there if we wish to explore. That is really what put me on this path to Tibetan Buddhism in particular. I think what is so important about meditation is it's the only way that we can experience the reality of our own minds directly and non-conceptually. To me, it's an amazing thing that our entire experience of reality from the day we're born till the day we die is mediated through our mind. And yet very, very rarely do we ever stop to ask the question, what is mind? And that is a question which Tibetan Buddhism explores in great detail. Not only what is mind, but how do we access it? How can we see it for ourselves? And through meditation, we can experience the true nature of our own mind. And when we do that, we discover some fascinating things. We find that all thoughts quite naturally arise, abide, and pass through our minds. We find that thoughts lead to feelings. And this is something we can only experience through meditation. When we experience that directly for ourselves, our whole view of who and what we are is radically transformed. And that's why meditation is such a profoundly important thing. It's not just about managing stress. It's not just about being more creative. It's not just about enjoying coffee and music more. All those benefits will definitely occur. It's about experiencing the true nature of our own minds, which, as I say, is this boundless state of radiance and bliss, if we persist. It's not going to happen in our first session, but it's something which creeps up on you, and you begin to realize, I had no idea that this is what I truly am.